Hi, I'm Charles Galda, President of Vision New England, and your host for the Church in Action program, where we talk with New England leaders about the imperative to make disciples, do justice, foster unity, and share Jesus to transform New England. Today, I've got a special friend with me. Jahdiel Perez is a professor at Villanova University, but you'll hear about his New England connection. But his home church is Harvest Ministries in Weymouth, Mass. That's where he grew up. He's got a BA from UMass, an MDiv from Harvard. He's completing his Doctorate of Philosophy at Oxford, where he was the president of the C.S. Lewis Society. And that's really the focus of our episode. But we're going to start talking about some other stuff first. But Jahdiel, thanks so much for being with us.
I'm very happy to be here. Thanks, Charles, for inviting me on this program.
And so can you maybe connect those dots? So tell a little bit about your background and your New England connection, if you would, please.
Yeah. So my father felt like God was calling him to start a church in Boston, Massachusetts for Hispanic families. So he left Guatemala and started that church 2 years before I was born. So I was basically born and raised in the Boston area. I'm a PK, a pastor's kid. And for quite a long time, I would say I was like intellectually asleep. So I wasn't interested in big questions. My father had to try to pay me to read books. Like literally, he would take a very small book, maybe something like the size of this, a small book. He would put like $50 throughout it. And I would be able to like get the $20 every chapter, every other chapter. And it never worked. So even money couldn't motivate me.
I didn't mention Jahdiel's father is the chairman of the board of Vision New England, and so he doesn't put money in books for me, Jahdiel. How do I get into that plan?
Yeah, this is one of the strategies that I tried to motivate me intellectually, but I was very apathetic. It just wasn't. My mind wasn't really turned on to anything until I was roughly 19 years old. And I went to go live in Guadalajara, Mexico with my uncle. And I went there just to practice my Spanish. And I went to his personal library and picked up this random book, which happened to be a Spanish translation of Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. And that was the spark for me that God used to kind of ignite my mind. And it had to do something with the structure of the text, which to me was very back and forward, like which mirrored my favorite game growing up, which was chess. And this idea, I felt like God was inviting me to play this game, this intellectual game that I love. I love chess. I'm decent, good at chess. What if I could love this? And that was what God used to wake me up to create a passion for reading, for education, for philosophy, theology, apologetics. And I remember looking at the back of the text and it's saying, oh, this author went to a place called Oxford. I had no idea where that was. And I remember calling my dad and saying, Dad, I want to go to Oxford. And because I had a horrible academic track record, he kind of laughed a little bit and said, maybe one day, but not immediately. You have to do a lot of groundwork to get there. But as the Lord would have it, years later, after doing my undergraduate, my master's degree, he opened the doors to go to Oxford and to study C.S. Lewis. And it's just been a dream come true. God has been very faithful. And I was able to be a tour guide at his home, to visit the colleges where he taught, just to really be immersed in his life world, in that culture. So that's how I connect the two dots of growing up in Boston and being drawn to C.S. Lewis.
And you said, and so you picked up a random book, maybe in retrospect, not so random.
Yeah, it was definitely, I think, providence, right? God drawing me. But it was just, he had so many books. I just reached out, grabbed one, and it happened to be, Mere Christianity. And that was the start of a whole new journey with me.
And then that led you to Oxford. And so you lived there for a few years, if I remember right.
That's correct. So my wife and I lived there for about 3 years. And then the pandemic really kicked up. So we moved back home to Boston and just to finalize my research here at home.
And so you were doing your doctoral work there at Oxford.
That's correct.
While you were there that time. Now you're finishing it up. And so maybe this may seem like a silly question, but there may be some people who haven't run into C.S. Lewis before. Who is C.S. Lewis?
So Clive Staples Lewis, some people don't know the first two initials. You get extra credit if you do. He was one of the most prolific writers, Christian writers of the first half of the 20th century. So some of his books are still on the best-selling lists like ever. So the Chronicles of Narnia are some of the best sellers ever. And he wrote in so many different genres, fiction, nonfiction. He wrote scholarship on English. He wrote for children, fantasy literature for children. He wrote fantasy for adults. He was an apologist, someone who tried to articulate and defend the faith in a way that married imagination and reason. So some people are good at one, but not the other. Some people are very logical, very rational, very philosophical, and others are very imaginative and creative. What was so special about Lewis is that God gave him both of those abilities. And he has just impacted millions of people around the world. Everybody wants a piece of him. It doesn't matter what stripe of believer you are, what political orientation, but there's so many people who are still enjoying his writing, and he still carries much influence today. So he was a speaker, a writer, an intellectual giant of his time.
It's a really good point you make in that, Narnia is such a creative fantasy world, and even the Screw Tape Letters I think of that way, which I just think is brilliant. But then but Mere Christianity is not something you expect from somebody who wrote something like Narnia.
That's correct. Yeah, you could read something like the Screw Tape Letters and then the Abolition of Man, and not tie them together, but it all came from the same mind. And what's really beautiful about him, his close friend Owen Barfield said that Lewis's vision permeated everything he wrote. So if you read one thing, in that one thing, his entire vision was contained. So anything that you wrote, anything that you read about him, whether it was fiction or nonfiction, it's all coming from the same mind, the same vision, which is a really beautiful and unique thing.
And I've mentioned, I want to go back to him a little bit, but Mere Christianity, Narnia, Screw Tape, are those the good primer? If somebody's not read C.S. Lewis and is listening and saying, hey, what's the right starting place? Where would you have them start?
I would ask first what genres they're most interested in. So I highly recommend the Chronicles of Narnia for anybody at any age. I mean, they're so good. He wrote them using a children's form, but he believed that no matter what age, you should be able to enjoy that form of fantasy. So I would say if you're into fiction, I'd say start with the Chronicles of Narnia. If you want nonfiction, I would definitely say Mere Christianity is a good place to start.
And I know the first time I went through Mere Christianity is I actually listened to it as a book on tape obviously years ago. And it was a collection of radio lectures he gave.
Yeah.
So actually listening to it probably is a more effective way. Would you agree? Or?
Yes, I actually had a friend just recently last week told me that he heard the entire thing on audiobook, and it just impacted him in a way that reading it didn't. And I think it's precisely because the BBC invited him to give a series of broadcasts to the British people. And this was during the Second World War. And his influence on the radio was second only to Winston Churchill himself. So everyone was listening to Lewis, gave these little 15-minute chunks of radio time. And his job was basically to reintroduce from a fresh perspective, what are the basics of Christianity? What do Christians believe? What are they supposed to live like? What do you need to have in place before Christianity makes sense? So listening to the book, I think ties you closer to the original context that it was delivered.
Now, C.S. Lewis, am I remembering right, he started out as an atheist.
So he became an atheist roughly when he was roughly like 13 years old. So he grew up in an Anglican context, but so his mother died when he was 9 years old. And part of the reason why he deconverted was because his prayers weren't working for his mother's healing. So the death of his mom really affected him. If you read his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, he says that he felt like all his sense of happiness and security just sunk like the continent of Atlantis, he says, never to be found again. And he also relates there that his frustration with prayer, his frustration with God, and that's one ingredient that at the age of 12 or 13, he just decided that the Christianity that he grew up with wasn't for him. So he rejects it roughly for around 18 years. And then when he's around 33 years of age, he reconverts to it. And it marks a huge difference in his life and writing, coming back to that Christian faith that he had inklings of as a child.
And I remember being at something Fran Collins was at. So Fran Collins is the former head of the National Institute of Health. He was the head of the Genome Project, right? Brilliant scientist. And he traced his faith because he was an atheist too. And he said, he set out to prove Christianity was wrong. He was an honest intellectual about it. And it was very much the same C.S. Lewis journey of, and in proving it wrong, I was convinced it was right. And is that a fair way to characterize C.S. Lewis's?
So Lewis's journey is a little bit like Augustine's, if you read the Confessions, right? There wasn't just one argument that convinced Augustine or Lewis, but it's a series of friendships. It's a series of encounters with books. It's a series of moments, encounters with nature that for Lewis, it was like a gradual process. He says some of it he wasn't really aware of or conscious of, and some of it he was. So it was a long process. Tolkien played a very important role in Lewis's conversion in 1931. And basically what Tolkien convinced Lewis of was that Jesus Christ was a myth made fact. And this idea like transformed Lewis's mind, because Tolkien said to Lewis, look, Lewis, when you read the pagan myths, when you read Balder, Osiris, when you read all these things and you see this theme of a dying and rising God, you're very moved. It grips you. It touches you very profoundly. But why is it that the same doesn't happen when you read Jesus? And Tolkien was a very devout Catholic his whole life. And Tolkien said, look, Jesus is like those myths with this one important exception, that it really happened. It really happened in history. God came into human history, became one of us, really died, really resurrected. So he's all the myths that you love, Lewis, made historical fact. And this idea was one of the central ideas that really opened the door to Christianity for Lewis. So it's a plethora of things. Some of it was arguments, some of it was insights from his friends. And he says he can't really pinpoint a moment when he said, okay, I'm a Christian now. He says he just took this ride with his brother. His brother had this kind of motorcycle with a little, a side place for him to sit in. And they were headed to the zoo. And he says, when I went to ride with my brother, I didn't believe in Jesus Christ. And then when I arrived at the zoo, I did, and it's a provocative way of saying how gradual and mysterious that process of conversion sometimes is and was in his personal life.
And seems to be more and more the story we hear today too. It's less and less what we might have expected 70 years ago of you present the truth of the gospel to me, I make a decision now. It is more of this process journey, maybe because we don't start at a common biblical point anymore, but it does seem like that's more the more common thing we say.
Yeah.
So what's your favorite C.S. Lewis book?
My official answer is the one that I read most recently. So it might be a cop-out. It might be a cop-out, but he is such a good writer.
Yeah.
That whatever I read will captivate me for that moment or season until I read something else that he wrote. So for instance, I just read and taught on The Weight of Glory this morning to some of my students in Villanova. And it's such a powerful sermon that I think, at least for the next few hours, I'm like, this is the best. This is my favorite, And then next week, if I pick up one of the Chronicles of Narnia, I'll just fall in love with it all over again. But I think if I had to pick a kind of reliable classic that I keep coming back to, For me, it's the Screw Tape Letters.
Mm.
If I had to pick one, I think that would be my favorite.
And so for the audience, what is C.S. Lewis doing in the Screw Tape Letters?
That's a very good question. So in the Screw Tape Letters, which he published in 1942, Lewis is trying to give, he calls the psychology of temptation from the other side. So from the demonic side. And he writes these series of letters, 31 letters, between this elder demon, who's named Screwtape, and then his younger demon, which is named Wormwood, right? Which is this like new demon that just got to hell. And he's in charge of making sure that his patient, so the human being, is damned eternally. So this is a series of letters where the elder demon is advising the younger demon on how to do his job properly.
Which by itself is a brilliant premise, right? Nobody else would have thought of that, I don't think.
Yeah. It's funny that the idea came to him when he was bored out of his mind during a church service. He says he was just so bored, and he thought he wanted to subvert that idea that there's something boring or dull about Christianity. And that's why if you read the two epigraphs that the text start with, it's one from Luther and Thomas More, and they say that the epigraphs say, if the devil does not submit to texts of scripture, jeer him, make fun of him. He's a proud spirit and he cannot endure to be mocked. And this idea that maybe humor, maybe satire can be a very powerful weapon against the devil. And that's part of what Lewis is doing in the Screw Tape Letters, is to satirize Satan. And he depicts him he depicts the demons as so obsessed with themselves that they cannot take themselves lightly. You know, they have to be austere and realistic. And part of what he's doing in the text is making fun of them.
Yeah, and you know, I thought the premise is just so great, but he also then pictures that the demon world is this massive bureaucracy, which isn't hard to convince me of. That sounds perfectly right to me.
Yeah.
But then what I thought, I read it fairly early on as a Christian, and I thought there's so many great observations of how evil works and how temptation works. And is that what he was trying to explore? Because he nails some of it. I remember the letter where he says to the nephew, where he's saying, you made a huge mistake here. You gave your subject the choice between real good and real evil, and you never do that. You've got to give them incremental shades of gray, so that they're over to the evil side before they ever realize it, right? And I'm like, and that's just it's a great insight to how evil works and how temptation works. Was he exploring that? Or was that something that he had already?
So Lewis states in his letters that was the explicit purpose of the Screw Tape Letters, was to depict the psychology of temptation, right? How does temptation work? And one of the insights is, he says that the surest, the safest path to hell is the one that doesn't have any sudden turnings, the one that's soft under our feet, the one that you don't even really notice that you're on. And he says the young demon is very eager to make the patient fall in these great ways, you know, murder, adultery, theft. And the older demon saying, look, he says, cards are no better than murder if cards can do the trick. And his idea is like, you just want these little tiny sins that their cumulative effect is to push the man away from the light and into the nothingness, right? So that the man, when he arrives to hell, he can look back on his life and say, I never did what I enjoyed, and I never did what I should. I always spent my life in this gray third area, which was just wasting time, but I never really even noticed this gradual path to perdition, to damnation. So I think that's one of the most powerful insights in the text.
Are there some misconceptions about Lewis?
What kind of misconceptions do you have in mind? You mean like culturally, or?
I have no idea. Just things we all think we know about him, but maybe we don't know.
Yeah. So especially Americans, we're tempted to think that Lewis was like this. He behaved like a great evangelical, right? when in reality, and what do I mean by that? Someone that never drank or smoked. You know how scandalous that would be, Charles, if you were caught at a bar drinking? I mean,
right?
That would be the scandal of the age, you know, or smoking. Lewis was an avid enjoyer of beer and wine, and he loved to smoke in his pipe with his friends like Tolkien. And that was something very normal. And when he had American students visit him, they were not expecting that. And there's one student that says, I don't know how he can be a man of God and also drink and smoke. But the parent of that student says, I'm convinced that that is a man of God, even though he does these things that, you know, that I wouldn't do. Yeah. But he had a mind very much like, if you read, if you see the depiction of Socrates in some of Plato's dialogues, he's a man that is in control of himself. So he can drink, but he's never drunk. He can enjoy wine, he can enjoy beer, but he doesn't lose control of himself. And that was C.S. Lewis very much. You know, he liked to have a merry time with his friends. And one of the things that we learned being tour guides for C.S. Lewis's home is that he didn't believe in ashtrays. So he had a smoking room where he would literally just smoke his pipe and pour the ashes on the rug. And this would infuriate some of the maids in the house. They'd be like, what is going on in this room? But it must have been, you know, it must have been pretty fun for him.
There's a cultural difference you remind me of. I remember Clive Calver, who is a friend of ours, saying how there was a world meeting of evangelicals. And when the European pastors saw the size of the diamond rings on the American women, their cigars fell in their beers.
Yeah.
Right? So, and we're both shocked at each other, right?
Yeah.
Because that's not the way we do it here.
Yeah.
And so what was he doing in Mere Christianity? Because that seems to be the seminal book that is a good primer, I think, for Lewis too, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. So it's interesting that in the year 2000, Christianity Today did a survey of what were the most impactful theology books. And they asked hundreds, thousands of American ministers, pastors, lay leaders to submit their texts. And the number one by far, by leaps and bounds, was Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. Karl Barth and Dietrich Bonhoeffer were second and third. But Christianity Today actually had to ask readers to stop submitting C.S. Lewis. That's how impactful this text has been. And he's trying to give the most basic, but also most persuasive articulation of what does it mean to be a Christian? What do you have to believe? What don't you have to believe? How should you live? And what can you hope for? At the very end, he tries to explain a little bit about the Trinity. He recognizes this is a mystery, but he thinks there are some things that can be said to approach that mystery better. So it's just it's a perennial task, really. It's trying to re-articulate for a new generation what does it mean to be Christian, and he managed to captivate still hundreds of thousands of minds.
Yeah, he does just such a great job of just walking through so logically, and we don't do things very logically anymore, but just walking through so logically that because of this, and this, there must be a God.
Yeah.
Right. And then he's very clear, but that's not the God of the Bible yet. I'm just proving there must be a God.
Yeah.
Now let's walk through, blah, 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 and it must be the God of the Bible.
Yeah. Right? I think part of his appeal is that he's like a detective almost. So he says, look, let's investigate these clues. How do you make sense of them? So he has this very well-known phrase that's actually on his tombstone. He says, I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. Right. And his idea was that Christianity was not just this set of doctrines, but a way of looking at the world, a way of making sense of things. So I appreciate that he doesn't necessarily want to say that this, like, you have to believe it. He says, look, it makes sense to believe this.
Yeah.
It's like he's trying to be a detective, trying to put the clues together. Look, you have this longing inside of you. You've been desiring something that you can't really articulate. Doesn't God make sense of that? Doesn't heaven make sense of that longing? Oh, you don't think so? Let's think through it a little bit more. So he's trying to tease his readers with meaning, with transcendence, with God. And it's in The Weight of Glory, he says, do you think I'm trying to weave a spell? He says, perhaps I am, but remember your fairy tale, spells are used for breaking enchantments as well as inducing them. So I think part of what Lewis is trying to do in all of his texts is to weave the right spell, the spell of, and this is one of the older meanings of gospel, good spell. He's trying to weave a kind of spell over his readers where we can wake up from the coma that sin has us in. Yeah. So that's part of what I really appreciate about his writing and what he's trying to do there in Mere Christianity.
Yeah, and I've been reading a lot by Dallas Willard lately, and he was making a similar point in what I was reading yesterday. He was saying too much of evangelicalism tries to teach you what to think, as opposed to let me share knowledge with you so that you can determine what makes the most sense about how you're going to live your life.
Yeah.
And that requires more thinking. And sometimes we just want to be told what to think because it's easier, but it's not, but it doesn't change what we believe then, right?
Yeah.
And so we've been doing a lot of work with leaders around New England and research. And what we've been hearing about what we've seen over the last 2 years, what we think God's exposed over the last couple of years, is there are so many people in the church who are biblically illiterate, consumers, partisans, and it's been so divisive. And we're not being transformed because we're not focused on disciple making. Now, this is a big thematic thing. This is in every church, every minister, right? But what would Lewis, so in our last couple of minutes, what would Lewis have to say to speak into that, the moment where we are?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So Lewis had this very clear idea of what specifically God had called him to do, specifically. He knew Billy Graham. I mean, he met with some representatives from Billy Graham's ministry, but he knew he wasn't Billy Graham. He said, I can't just stand up at a church and give this appeal, come to Jesus moment. He says, I think that's absolutely necessary, but I am not ready or made to do that. He was kind of very introverted, actually. But he said the best strategy would be to have both. Somebody that goes in, knocks down the obstacles to faith, and then somebody who comes in and makes a strong appeal to the heart. So somebody that can deal with the head, somebody that can deal with the heart. And he had this idea of what specifically, God had called him to do, even if it put him at a disadvantage. So many people don't know that Oxford did not make him an official professor at the university. It was only after he went to Cambridge University that he became a full professor. Part of that was because he had written these theology books that everybody was reading. And his colleagues at Oxford thought, you can't be a serious academic if you're writing things like the Screw Tape Letters, The Problem of Pain. Hundreds, thousands of people are reading it. There's no way you could be serious and thorough and profound. So listen to this. Even though it put him at a professional disadvantage, he knew that this is what God had called him to do. And I feel like part of the message that he would tell us is to try to discern very specifically what part of the puzzle does my calling, does my ministry fit in? And to be aware that we need each other, that it's not just one person, but that there are teams, groups of people that should be walking by each other's side to complement each other. And that's not always clear in terms of ministry. I think it's very tempting to feel like I'm doing what's most important. I'm at the top of the mountain. God only needs me. I'm not saying that we say that explicitly, but sometimes, the enemy might want to sneak that in to our lives. But Lewis knew very clearly, this is net fishing. This is not line fishing. This is a teamwork, team endeavor. And I think we could learn a lot about that, especially in New England, is what other ministries can we partner with? who's doing what, what specifically did God call Charles to do? How can I complement that? How can I support that? How can we help each other out? So I think that's part of what his example in his life might show us for this moment.
Jahdiel, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for sharing your expertise and your studies. I'm sorry it flew by so fast. This was fascinating. Thank you so much.
It was so much fun. They're right. Time flies when you're having fun. So thank you so much for having me on this program, Charles. And I hope it's a blessing to the people that are listening.
I trust and know it will be. Thank you. And I'd also like to thank our producer, Jess Mangano, and our listeners. Hope this dialogue fascinated you too, and it helps us be the people of God doing the work of God to transform our world. Visit visionNewEngland.org for past episodes and resources, and you can click on Donate to partner with us to accelerate evangelism in New England. This program is brought to you by our friends at the Luis Palau Association, who are dedicated to proclaiming the good news, uniting the church, and impacting cities worldwide.